This past Thursday night, more than 20 million people around the world walked into a building, sat down in silence, and did something that most Christians, when they see it for the first time, cannot believe with their own eyes. A small plate of unleavened bread was placed in their hands. They were told it represented the body of Jesus Christ, broken for the sins of the world, and they passed it on without eating. A cup of red wine followed. They were told it represented the blood of Jesus Christ, poured out for the forgiveness of humanity, and they passed it on without drinking. Out of those 20 million people, fewer than 22,000 were permitted to partake. The rest, more than 19,978,000 souls, held the body and blood of Christ in their hands, looked at it, and refused it. Then they went home and called it the most sacred night of the year. This is the memorial of Christ's death, as observed by Jehovah's Witnesses. It happened 3 nights ago, on Thursday, April 2nd, 2026. And tonight, we are going to investigate the most disturbing question a Christian observer can ask about this ceremony. What does it actually mean, in the eyes of Jesus himself, when a human being holds the bread and the cup in their hands and deliberately passes them on? Because when you read what Jesus said about this exact act, in his own words, recorded in the Gospel of John, the answer becomes something that no witness in that hall was allowed to hear from the platform. Part 1. To understand what really happened inside a kingdom hall on Thursday night, you first have to see it. It was the evening of April 2nd, the date calculated from the Jewish month of Nisan by a committee of elderly men in New York State. The hall had been cleaned with unusual care. A white tablecloth covered a small table at the front, and on that table rested 2 objects. A plate of unleavened bread, baked that morning according to a recipe passed down through decades, and a cup of red wine, required by the organization to contain real alcohol, because the symbolism must be exact. A speaker delivered a talk assigned from headquarters. Every kingdom hall on earth heard a version of the same words on the same night. And then, at a precise moment, the plates began to move, row by row, seat by seat, through the entire hall, and almost no one ate. In a congregation of 100 people, perhaps one partook. In a congregation of 200, often none at all. Children watched their parents refuse. First-time visitors, invited with warm smiles only weeks before, followed the example of everyone around them and passed the plate along untouched. The bread returned to the front, nearly whole. The wine returned to the front, nearly full. And the meeting ended, and everyone went home, and they called it the most sacred night of the year. The numbers are published by the Watchtower organization itself. Global memorial attendance this year exceeded 20 million. The number who partook hovered around 21,000, 1 in 1,000, 0.1%. For every person at the table, 999 spectators watched the emblems pass and refused to touch them. There is no other ceremony like this anywhere in the Christian world. And to understand why that is so staggering, we have to go directly to the words of Jesus himself. Part 2. In the 6th chapter of the Gospel of John, Jesus speaks about the bread and the wine more directly and more forcefully than anywhere else in the New Testament. He does not use symbols that can be debated. He does not leave the instruction open to interpretation. In verse 53, he says, and these are his own words, truly, truly, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in yourselves. Read that sentence again. Unless you eat, unless you drink, you have no life in yourselves. This is not a suggestion. This is not an option reserved for a select few. This is Jesus Christ speaking to anyone who wishes to follow him and telling them, in the strongest language he uses anywhere in the Gospels, that to partake of the bread and the wine is not optional. It is the line between life and the absence of life. On the night before his crucifixion, in the upper room in Jerusalem, Jesus took bread, broke it, and gave it to his disciples. All of them. He took the cup, blessed it, and passed it to his disciples. All of them. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 22, verse 19, he says, "Do this in remembrance of me." He does not say, "Do this if you are one of a select 144,000. He does not say, "Do this only if you have a heavenly calling." He says, "Do this in remembrance of me." The Apostle Paul, writing later to the congregation at Corinth in the 11th chapter of his first letter, instructs the entire church on how to partake. He does not write to a spiritual elite inside the church. He writes to everyone, and he commands them to examine themselves and eat the bread and drink the cup. For 1900 years of Christian history, from the first century church in Jerusalem to the Catholics, the Orthodox, the Protestants, the Baptists, the Pentecostals, no Christian tradition on earth ever divided its members into two permanent spiritual classes at the communion table, where one group ate and the other group watched. Whatever disagreements Christians had with each other, and they had many, on this single point they agreed. The bread and the cup were offered to every believer in the room, because Jesus had commanded it. And then, in the spring of 1935, in a hotel ballroom in Washington, D.C., one man stood up and changed that. Part 3. The man was Joseph Franklin Rutherford, a former judge from Missouri, 65 years old, over 6 feet tall, with a heavy frame and a voice described by contemporaries as a thunderclap. He had inherited the leadership of the movement from its founder Charles Taze Russell in 1917, and he had already reshaped it almost completely, giving the group its new name, Jehovah's Witnesses, just 4 years earlier. On a Friday afternoon in the last week of May 1935, Rutherford rose to the platform of that Washington convention and delivered a discourse titled The Great Multitude. And somewhere in the middle of that talk, without warning, he announced a new doctrine. The number of Christians going to heaven, he said, had been fixed long ago at 144,000, a figure taken symbolically from the book of Revelation. That number, he said, was nearly complete. From that day forward, new members joining the movement would not be going to heaven at all. They would have a different hope, an earthly hope, a resurrection to a paradise on a cleansed earth. And since the bread and the wine, according to his interpretation, belonged only to those with the heavenly calling, the new converts were no longer permitted to partake of them. Think carefully about what just happened in that ballroom. A single man, with no counsel, no vote, no deliberation with any other Christian body, with no appeal to any authority beyond his own interpretation of a symbolic number in an apocalyptic book, had just overturned 1900 years of Christian practice. He had just told his followers that the direct command of Jesus in John chapter 6, to eat the flesh and drink the blood, did not apply to them. He had just taken the plain instruction of Jesus in the upper room, "Do this in remembrance of me," and declared that most of the people in the room were no longer included in that "this." And his followers, who had come to Washington believing they were gathering for worship, sat down and accepted it. Because Rutherford had spoken, this is the moment, this is the origin of the ceremony that played out in kingdom halls across the world 3 nights ago. The exclusion that was witnessed on Thursday is not a tradition handed down from the apostles. It is not a command preserved in Scripture. It is the lingering effect of one afternoon, in one ballroom, in one city, in 1935, when a judge from Missouri invented a reason for the majority of Christ's followers to refuse the bread and the cup that Christ himself had commanded them to take. Part 4, and here we arrive at something that makes the ceremony even harder to understand. The organization that teaches its members to refuse the body and blood of Christ is not a poor organization. It is one of the wealthiest religious corporations on earth. Its headquarters sit on a sprawling property in Warwick, New York, built at a cost estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Over the past decade, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society has sold its former Brooklyn real estate holdings for more than $2 billion in documented transactions. It operates branch offices and printing facilities in scores of countries, managed by an unpaid workforce of volunteers who are fed and housed in exchange for their labor. And yet, across the entire Jehovah's Witness organization, there is not a single hospital, not one. There are no soup kitchens for the poor. There are no orphanages for the abandoned. There are no homeless shelters. There are no free clinics serving the communities where witnesses live and knock on doors. For a religion that insists it is the only true form of Christianity on earth, there is a remarkable absence of the one thing Jesus said his followers would be known for. "By this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another," he said in John chapter 13. And yet the charitable footprint of an organization worth billions is, by its own published accounting, almost invisible. What the organization does, instead, is ask. At every meeting, donation boxes stand near the doors. In every Watchtower magazine, appeals for contributions appear. Every year, congregations are asked to send money upward to the branch, and the branch sends it upward to the world headquarters. The hand is always extended, and the members, many of them elderly, many of them on fixed incomes, many of them forbidden by the organization from pursuing higher education that might have led to better careers, give what they can. They give because they have been taught that the organization is God's channel on earth. They give because they fear what will happen if they do not. And on Thursday night, they walked into the memorial and held the bread and the cup in their hands, and they passed them on because the same organization that asks them for money had told them that the body and blood of Christ were not for them. Part 5. There is one more thing worth pointing out about the memorial, and it is so obvious that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The word memorial, in every language in which it exists, means a ceremony for the dead. You hold a memorial for someone who has passed away. You visit a memorial at a cemetery, at a battlefield, at a monument for those who are no longer with us. And this raises a question that every Christian outside the Kingdom Hall asks sooner or later. If Jesus Christ rose from the dead, if he is alive, as every Christian tradition for 2,000 years has proclaimed, then why would his followers gather once a year to hold a memorial for him? The answer tells you everything about what this ceremony actually is. For the rest of the Christian world, the bread and the cup are not a memorial service. They are a communion, a participation, a joining with a living Christ who is present among his people. The Greek word used in 1 Corinthians, koinonia, means fellowship, sharing, communion with the living. It is an act of being with Christ, not mourning him. But inside the Kingdom Hall on Thursday night, the ceremony had been stripped of its living heart. It had been turned into a funeral that most of the mourners were not even allowed to participate in. They gathered to remember a death, not to commune with a risen Lord. And when they held the bread and the cup, they did not hold them as a sharing with the living Christ. They held them as objects belonging to other people, passed through their hands for the benefit of someone else. And then there is the contradiction at the center of all of this that the governing body has never been able to resolve. For decades, the leadership has defended the division of the flock by citing the words of Jesus in John chapter 10, verse 16. Jesus said he had other sheep, which were not of this fold, and that those other sheep would listen to his voice, and that there would be one flock, one shepherd. The leadership uses this verse to argue that the anointed and the great crowd, though they eat at separate tables, are somehow still united. But read the verse slowly. Jesus did not say there would be one flock divided into two categories with different destinies at his table. He said there would be one flock, singular, undivided, one shepherd, one voice, one body. The verse the leadership uses to defend the division is, in fact, the verse that most clearly denies it. And on Thursday night, no one in those halls said anything, because no one in those halls could say anything. To question it is to step outside, and stepping outside carries a cost that every witness knows by heart: the loss of family, the loss of friends, the loss of the only community they have ever known. So the contradiction hung in the air once again, as it has every spring for nearly a century. And the plates kept moving, and the bread kept returning to the front of the hall, almost untouched. If you are a Christian who has never seen a memorial from the inside, sit with what happened 3 nights ago. 20 million people. The bread of Christ passed from hand to hand. The cup of Christ passed from hand to hand. And almost every one of them refused, because a judge from Missouri told them 90 years ago that the command of Jesus in John chapter 6 did not apply to them. Ask yourself what Jesus would have said, standing in the back of one of those halls on Thursday night, watching his own followers hold his body and his blood and give it back untouched. Ask yourself how the words, "Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in yourselves," could be more clearly disobeyed than by a ritual in which 20 million people did precisely that a few days ago and called it worship. And if you were raised as a Jehovah's Witness, or if you attended the memorial this past Thursday, or if you held the bread in your own hands 3 nights ago and passed it on, take a moment now, while no elder is watching you, while no brother is standing at the door, and read John chapter 6 for yourself. Read verses 53 through 58. Read them slowly. Read them out loud if you can. And ask yourself one question. When Jesus said those words, who was he talking to? Was he talking to a select 144,000? A number he never once mentioned in connection with the bread and the cup? Or was he talking to you? Because the answer is not in a Watchtower magazine. The answer is not in a talk from the platform. The answer is in the Bible you hold in your own hands, in the words of Jesus himself, and those words have never changed, no matter what a judge from Missouri decided in 1935. You do not need a man to tell you whether the bread of Christ is meant for you. Jesus already answered that question. He answered it in the upper room, when he passed the cup to every disciple in the circle. He answered it in John chapter 6, when he said, "Unless you eat and drink, you have no life." And he is still answering it today, to anyone willing to open the book and read. If this investigation opened your eyes to something you had never seen clearly before, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment below with your own thoughts on what you just learned, and share this video with someone who may need to hear it. Every comment, every share, helps this story reach the people who held the bread this past Thursday and are still wondering tonight why they were told to give it back. Thank you for being here. We will see you in the next investigation.